I opened a letter addressed to my husband from a state vital records office, expecting nothing more than a routine renewal notice, and instead found a formal document confirming that my husband, Aaron, had been declared legally dead by a county court 11 years ago. Not missing, not presumed dead pending investigation. Legally, officially dead, with a death certificate on file, a closed estate, and a life insurance payout of $400,000 already collected by the family he'd apparently abandoned 2 years before that court declaration ever happened. My name is Christine, and this is the story of the single strangest, most disorienting discovery of my entire life. One that began with a piece of routine-looking mail and ended with me learning that the man I'd been married to for 6 years had once been someone else's husband and father, someone who had simply vanished, been declared legally dead, and let his first family collect on his death, before quietly building an entirely new identity and life with me, never once mentioning any of it. I want to explain how I met Aaron and what our relationship looked like before this discovery, because I think understanding the genuine, ordinary texture of our life together matters to understanding just how completely this revelation upended everything I believed I knew about my own husband. We met 8 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party, married 2 years later, and built what I'd always considered a stable, if unremarkable, life together. A modest house, steady jobs, no children, yet though we'd begun discussing the possibility more seriously over the preceding year. I remember, specifically, how genuinely present and stable Aaron always seemed throughout our entire relationship, the kind of steady, reliable partner who never gave me any reason to suspect he was carrying any kind of significant, unresolved history. He talked, occasionally, in vague terms about a difficult period in his 20s, describing it simply as a rough patch he'd worked through with considerable personal effort, language that, in hindsight, represented an enormous understatement of what he'd actually experienced and done during that period, but that felt, at the time, like ordinary, unremarkable personal history most adults carry in some form. I want to describe the specific letter that ultimately unraveled this entire situation, because the mundane circumstances of its arrival matter to understanding just how accidentally this devastating truth came to light. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday, addressed to Aaron, from a state vital records office in a state neither of us had any particular connection to, at least as far as I understood our shared history. I assumed, when I first saw it, that it represented some kind of clerical error or outdated mailing list artifact, the kind of misdirected mail most households occasionally receive. I opened it, a decision I made without much thought, given that Aaron and I had never maintained particularly strict boundaries around each other's mail throughout our marriage, understanding this as simply routine, unremarkable behavior rather than anything requiring hesitation. I want to describe the specific, disorienting shock of what I actually found inside that envelope. A formal notice regarding updated vital records procedures, referencing, by name and social security number, a death certificate on file for someone named Aaron Whitfield, born on the exact date I knew as my husband's birthday, with a death date recorded as occurring roughly 11 years earlier. I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous confusion of reading this document, initially assuming it must reference some other person who happened to share my husband's name and birth date, a coincidence unsettling but not impossible, before continuing to read further details that made this explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. The document referenced a specific court case number, a county I didn't recognize, and a brief administrative summary indicating the death had been formally, legally declared following a multi-year absence and presumed death proceeding initiated by his then-wife. A name I had never heard before, Deborah Whitfield. I want to describe the following hours, sitting alone in our kitchen with this devastating document, trying to process information that seemed almost impossible to fully comprehend, waiting for Aaron to return home from work so I could finally, directly ask him what any of this actually meant. I confronted him the moment he walked through our front door, holding out the letter with hands that had been shaking for hours by that point. Aaron, I need you to explain this to me right now. I want to describe watching my husband's face as he read that document. Watching years of what I now understand was carefully maintained composure finally, completely crack open in front of me. He sat down heavily at our kitchen table, and after a long, devastating silence, he said, "I always knew this day might eventually come. I just hoped it wouldn't." What followed was one of the most disorienting conversations of my entire life. Aaron slowly, painfully revealing a truth about his own history that fundamentally contradicted everything I'd believed about the man I'd married 6 years earlier. I want to describe the actual history Aaron eventually revealed, delivered in fragments over what became several exhausting hours of conversation. Roughly 13 years before I ever met him, Aaron had been married to a woman named Deborah, with whom he had two young children, then ages 4 and 6. According to his account, he had been struggling, during this period, with severe, undiagnosed depression and what he eventually characterized as a genuine mental health crisis, one that led him, roughly 2 years before his eventual legal death declaration, to simply disappear from his entire previous life without any warning or explanation to his wife or children. "I know how this sounds," he told me, during this devastating confession. "I know there's no way to explain walking away from your own kids that doesn't sound monstrous. I was in a genuinely terrible place mentally, worse than I've ever fully explained to you or anyone else. I convinced myself, in whatever distorted state I was in at the time, that they'd all be better off without me, that I was some kind of burden or danger to them rather than someone worth staying for." I want to describe learning the specific timeline of what happened after Aaron's initial disappearance, understanding that he had, according to his own account, spent the following 2 years living under a series of temporary situations, eventually settling in a different state entirely, gradually building what became an entirely new identity and life, while Deborah, unable to locate him despite what he understood were genuine efforts on her part, eventually pursued formal legal proceedings to have him declared legally dead, a process that, after the requisite waiting period established by law for cases of genuine, unexplained disappearance, ultimately succeeded roughly 2 years after he'd initially vanished. I want to try to describe the specific, layered devastation of learning that my husband's previous wife had collected a $400,000 life insurance payout based on a death that, however legally recognized through proper court proceedings, had never actually genuinely occurred, understanding that Aaron had been alive throughout this entire period, aware, at least eventually, that this legal declaration had taken place, and had never once, in the following 11 years, taken any steps to correct this fundamentally fraudulent situation. "You knew you'd been declared dead," I said, my voice shaking as the full weight of this revelation continued crystallizing. "You knew Deborah had collected life insurance money based on your death, and you never told anyone the truth. You built an entire new life, married me, and let this fraud just continue indefinitely." I want to describe Aaron's specific explanation for this sustained silence, an explanation that, while providing some psychological context, never fully justified the specific, ongoing choice to allow this fraudulent situation to persist rather than eventually taking steps to address it honestly, regardless of how difficult or legally complicated that correction might have proven. By the time I was stable enough to even consider going back and fixing any of this, so much time had passed, he said. I'd built an entirely new identity, a new social security number through means I'm not proud of, a whole new legal existence. Correcting it would have meant essentially destroying everything I'd rebuilt, admitting to massive fraud, probably facing serious legal consequences myself. I told myself, for years, that the damage was already done, that going back and fixing it now would just cause more harm than simply letting it stay in the past. I want to describe the specific, exhausting process of understanding the actual legal complexity our own marriage now existed within, given that Aaron's legal identity, the very name and social security number under which we'd married, apparently represented a fabricated identity constructed after his original legal death declaration, rather than his genuine, original legal identity. I consulted with an attorney roughly a week after this devastating discovery, a careful, experienced man named Mr. Sorensen who specialized in complex identity and estate matters. Understanding I needed genuine legal guidance regarding both my own marriage's actual legal validity and the broader question of what obligations, if any, existed regarding correcting this decade-plus fraudulent situation. "This is, genuinely, one of the more complicated situations I've encountered," Mr. Sorensen told me, during our initial consultation, after I'd explained the full situation. "Your husband is potentially exposed to serious legal liability regarding both the original fraudulent death declaration and whatever identity documents he subsequently used to build his current legal existence. Your own marriage's validity depends significantly on which specific legal identity was actually used during your marriage ceremony, a question that may require considerable investigation to fully untangle. I want to describe the following months, an exhausting, disorienting process of navigating both the practical legal complexity this situation introduced and the much deeper, more painful question of whether I could genuinely continue a marriage built upon this level of sustained, fundamental deception regarding my husband's actual identity and history. I want to describe my own difficult, extended process of determining whether to report this situation to relevant authorities, understanding the genuine legal seriousness of what Aaron had done, both the original fraudulent death declaration his disappearance had enabled, and his subsequent, sustained silence regarding the ongoing insurance fraud this situation represented weighed against my own complicated feelings about potentially exposing him to serious legal consequences, understanding how genuinely, severely he'd apparently struggled with mental health crisis during the original disappearance. I want to describe the specific, agonizing decision I ultimately reached, choosing, after extensive consultation with Mr. Sorensen and considerable personal reflection, to require, as a condition of remaining in our marriage, that Aaron voluntarily disclose the full situation to relevant authorities and to Deborah directly, rather than continuing to let this fraudulent situation persist indefinitely. Understanding this represented the only path forward that felt genuinely consistent with the values I needed our marriage to actually be built upon going forward. Aaron ultimately agreed to this condition, a decision that led to an extended, genuinely difficult legal process over the following year, involving formal correction of his legal death declaration, extensive legal proceedings regarding the fraudulently collected insurance payout, and, most emotionally complicated of all, his first direct contact in over 13 years with Deborah and the 2 children he'd abandoned, now young adults themselves. I want to describe the specific, surreal experience of Aaron's eventual meeting with his now adult children, a reunion I wasn't directly present for, but that he described to me afterward as simultaneously the most important and most painful conversation of his entire life. His children carrying, understandably, complicated, significant anger regarding the father who had simply vanished from their lives when they were young, anger that his eventual explanation and legal correction, however genuinely undertaken, couldn't fully resolve or erase. I want to describe the specific, ongoing legal resolution of the insurance fraud itself, a process that ultimately required Deborah to repay a portion of the original payout, though our attorneys worked to establish a reasonable, extended repayment structure given that she had, entirely in good faith, used those funds over the preceding decade to raise their 2 children as a single parent, without any knowledge that Aaron remained alive throughout this entire period. I want to be honest about my own difficult, ongoing process of determining whether our marriage could genuinely survive this level of foundational deception, understanding that beyond the specific legal fraud involved, I now needed to fundamentally reconsider my entire understanding of who my husband actually was, a man capable of walking away from his own young children during a genuine crisis, and then sustaining, for over a decade, a fraudulent legal existence rather than ever taking active steps to correct the situation until external circumstances essentially forced the issue. Aaron and I ultimately separated roughly 8 months after this initial discovery, a decision I reached after extensive individual therapy, specifically addressing the fundamental question of whether I could genuinely trust a partnership built upon this level of sustained, foundational deception regarding his own identity and history, regardless of how much genuine remorse and cooperation he demonstrated once the truth finally emerged. I want to describe the specific, ongoing complexity of processing this particular experience, understanding that Aaron's underlying mental health crisis during his original disappearance represented a genuine, serious struggle deserving of compassion and understanding, even while his subsequent decade of sustained silence and fraud, once he'd presumably stabilized enough to make more deliberate choices, represented a considerably more troubling pattern of ongoing deception that ultimately proved incompatible with the kind of foundational trust one needed our marriage to be built upon. It's been just over 18 months since that initial, devastating letter first revealed this entire hidden history. I think, often, about the specific, strange nature of building 6 years of genuine, if ultimately fundamentally compromised, partnership with someone whose most basic legal identity turned out to be constructed atop an elaborate, sustained fraud I had absolutely no knowledge of throughout our entire relationship. If you've ever discovered that your partner's most fundamental identity or personal history rested on a foundation of sustained deception you had no way of detecting throughout years of otherwise genuine partnership, I want to hear how you navigated both the practical legal complexity and the deeper question of whether trust, once built on such a compromised foundation, can genuinely be salvaged. I used to believe that 6 years of consistent, genuine daily partnership represented sufficient evidence of truly knowing another person completely. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that even years of apparently authentic, functional partnership can exist atop foundational deception so complete that an entire previous life, an entire abandoned family, and a decade of ongoing fraud can remain completely hidden until something as ordinary as a piece of misdirected mail finally, accidentally lets the truth through.